It is well known by now that the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, of segregation, of Jim Crow, of the Ku Klux Klan, of racial terrorism. The Democrats try very hard to escape this historical responsibility, to duck out of it, if you will. And one of the central claims we hear from the left these days is that Lincoln was actually a progressive. And moreover, that the Southern segregationists were actually conservative. I want to focus on these two claims and debunk them. First of all, Lincoln never described himself as a progressive. We need to define our terms a little bit here, because progressive means moving away from the principles of the founding. Conservative means conserving the principles of the founding. That's how we define those terms today, and that's how they were understood to some degree from the outset. Now, if you read Lincoln's Cooper Union speech, it's very clear that Lincoln says the founders, he devotes much of the speech to proving that the founders were formidably and vehemently anti-slavery. And then he says this: we, the Republicans, want to do nothing more than go back to the principles of the founders. In a sense, he says we want to make America great again. We want to put slavery where it was at the founding on a course of ultimate extinction. Whereas the Democrats, on the other hand, want to move away from the founding. They're progressive in that sense, and they want slavery to be seen as a positive good. Lincoln repeatedly called himself a conservative. He never called himself a progressive. Now let's turn to the Southern segregationists and the idea that they were somehow conservative. In what sense? Not in any modern sense of the term conservative. I guess it's in the operational sense that they were trying to preserve something or hold on to something of very old origin. But the point is that segregation is not a very old origin. Segregation laws were imposed starting in the 1880s and 1890s by the Democrats. Every segregation law in the American South passed by a Democratic legislature, enforced by Democratic officials, and so on. And let's remember, when Woodrow Wilson brought segregation to the federal government, this wasn't some long-standing practice. There was no segregation in the federal government before. It was an innovation, a modern step by this progressive president, the first progressive president in American history, to bring in something new that didn't exist before. So in what sense was Wilson a conservative? In no meaningful sense at all. In fact, he saw himself as a progressive. His segregation policies were progressive in that sense. So what we're seeing here is a terrible, misleading, and bogus sleight of hand being used by the intellectual left to do what? To cover up the crimes of the Democratic Party. And why? Because that's the party they belong to. Otherwise, they'd have to accept that all these terrible historical evils were evils that their party did, that their party needs to acknowledge, that their party needs to atone for.